Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. It was not the sun, but the bell, that told you when the day was over. In the heart of many medieval towns, as the light bled from the sky and shadows lengthened across timber-framed streets, a single, low, resonant sound rolled over the rooftops. The curfew bell. It didn't ring for celebration. It didn't call you to worship. It called you indoors. Its meaning was blunt: put out your fires, snuff your candles, secure your shutters, and stay inside until morning. It was a law, one written in civic codes, enforced by guards, and, in some places, punishable by fine or worse. The medieval curfew was not a matter of politeness, it was a tool of order and control. Fires were the great destroyer of medieval cities. And an open flame in the wrong hands could reduce half a town to ash in hours. But the curfew also served another purpose: it cleared the streets. By striking the bell at an appointed time, sometimes as early as 8 in the evening, city leaders compressed daily activity into predictable daylight hours, and so, without anyone calling it such, medieval society invented what we might now recognize as rush hour. The final hours before the bell were a frantic race: merchants packing up stalls, apprentices hauling goods back to storage, craftsmen finishing orders, servants rushing to buy bread before the baker closed his oven. Streets that were quiet at mid-afternoon would swell with clatter and shouts. Carts and horses jostling for space, the bell shaped behavior as surely as the seasons shaped planting and harvest. Evenings were not for leisure strolls or twilight markets, they were for being home, and being quiet. If you imagine this pace as quaint, or slow, you'd be mistaken. For those who lived under the curfew law, life ran on a fixed clock that had no room for delay. When the bell rang, doors were shut. And in winter, that could mean your workday ended in what we would call mid-afternoon. Now imagine, after hours of rushing through grimy, crowded lanes, past butchers rinsing blood into gutters and fishmongers scraping scales into the street, you suddenly needed medical care. There was no popping into an after-hours clinic. No emergency ward glowing with fluorescent light. The surgeon's shop had closed when the curfew bell rang. And even if you somehow got in, the conditions inside would not be survivable for most of us today. In those cramped, firelit rooms, surgeons worked without anesthesia, without antiseptic, and without anything resembling sterile tools. They stitched wounds in the same air that carried the stink of the day's market. The rush hour outside might be ending. But your ordeal was only beginning, one you likely wouldn't live to see the morning from. The connection is simple but sobering. The same compressed working hours that medieval people rushed to beat, to close deals, to bake bread, to complete tasks before curfew, also applied to medical care. You did not have the luxury of lingering at your workshop if you were ill or injured. Survival meant making it to the surgeon before the bell. And praying you didn't need him after. As we drift deeper into this story, keep this in mind: the rhythms of medieval life were not only about work and rest, they were about survival in a world where the night was a thing to be feared, controlled, and enforced by law. The bell had rung an hour ago. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it had been arranged, deliberate, imposed. But inside a small timbered shop at the end of Breadmaker's Lane, a man was working against that silence. Matthias, son of a baker and grandson of another before him, stood before the wide mouth of his oven. It was the heart of his livelihood, a black, arched space of stone and brick that still radiated heat from the day's baking. Bread was a daily need, and most ovens were fired in the early hours so loaves could be ready by dawn. But Matthias had been experimenting: a richer, denser loaf for a wealthier clientele, made with imported grains that needed a slower, longer bake. And that meant heat. Steady heat. Well past the bell, the law was clear: after the curfew bell, all flames were to be covered, all ovens banked, all work stopped. A warm oven after hours was as suspicious as a shouting voice in the street. Fire risk was only one concern. Unwatched ovens drew thieves, men who might not stop at bread, yet Matthias could not let the heat die. This dough was his investment. If he left it until morning, it would collapse, sour, or worse. And so he worked quietly, slipping loaves onto the oven's hot stones, each motion careful, deliberate, without the usual chatter of apprentices or creak of shutters. Outside, the sound of boots echoed faintly on the cobbles. The night watch, they carried lanterns and short clubs, and the light from their patrol swept briefly across Matthias's shuttered windows. He froze. The punishment for breaking curfew wasn't always severe, sometimes a fine, sometimes a warning, but it could be harsher if the watch suspected you were harboring others, or conducting business in secret. The authorities feared gatherings at night; they were hard to monitor and could lead to unrest. Matthias stayed still until the boots moved on. Then he opened the oven's iron peel and pulled a loaf halfway out, testing its crust. The smell was intoxicating: warm grain, browned to perfection. He thought of his customers who would pay double for such bread, the coin it would bring, and the advantage over other bakers. He told himself it was worth the risk, but as he stacked the first batch onto the cooling rack, there was a knock at the back door. A knock after curfew was never good. He hesitated, hand hovering above the latch. The knock came again, softer, followed by a whisper of his name. It was a neighbor, a brewer's boy, eyes wide in the moonlight. He wanted bread, not for himself, but for the brewer, whose alehouse was hosting a group of traveling merchants who had arrived late. Merchants with coin. Matthias's heart pounded. Selling after curfew was illegal, doubly so if it involved serving drink or food to a gathering. But the boy was insistent, sliding a silver penny across the threshold. It gleamed like a tiny moon in the dark. He took it. Just for one loaf, he told himself. Then another knock, this time from the front, loud, urgent. Not the watch, not yet, but a customer who had seen the light and smelled the bread. Within minutes, Matthias was serving quietly through a crack in the shutter, exchanging bread for coins in quick, tense gestures. The night, which had begun in silence, was suddenly alive with whispers and furtive footsteps. Word of fresh bread spread faster than he liked. Soon, the noise drew the wrong kind of attention. A shout broke the quiet. Open in the name of the watch. The lantern's light flooded his doorway. Matthias had no choice but to open the door. The watch captain stepped in. Eyes scanning the still warm loaves, the oven glowing faintly. His expression was unreadable. Matthias expected the fine, perhaps confiscation of his goods. But the captain instead took a loaf, tore it open, inhaled deeply, and said nothing. He placed a coin on the counter and left without a word. The baker stood frozen long after the door shut. The rules were not always broken the same way. Sometimes, they bent in silence. The bell had long since rung, shutters were closed, doors barred, and the streets had settled into their sanctioned stillness. Only a few souls were permitted to walk openly after curfew, guards on patrol, messengers on urgent civic duty. And the lamplighters, they were the quiet keepers of the city's second light. By day, the sun lit every corner; by night, the lamplighters pushed back the dark just enough to make movement possible, safe, and, for the few still allowed outdoors, legal. The job was part necessity, part ritual. The lamplighters began their work in the final moments of twilight, climbing narrow ladders to reach the heavy iron lamps that hung from wooden posts or protruded from the walls of important buildings. The lamps burned oil or tallow, their flames housed in glass and iron to resist wind and rain. In some towns, the lamplighters wore small badges of authority, proof they were exempt from the curfew law during their rounds. Without it, they could be stopped, questioned, or fined like anyone else. Even so, they kept their movements brisk. The fewer minutes spent in the open after the bell, the better. One of them, a man named Raoul, had been lighting the lamps for nearly 20 years. His route was etched into muscle memory: the lift of the ladder, the scrape of the flint, the small puff of light in the glass chamber, then down again and onward. The work was lonely, but it offered a strange privilege: a view of the city in its hushed, post-bell state. He saw the silhouettes of cats crossing empty market squares, the glint of moonlight on wet roofs, the faint plumes of smoke that slipped through badly banked chimneys, yet the job carried danger. Even with his badge, Raoul sometimes attracted unwanted attention. A lamplighter's satchel was full of valuable oil, and thieves knew the lamplighter's route. The flicker of a newly lit lamp could be a beacon not just for honest travelers, but for those who preferred to move unseen. This night, Raoul had just finished lighting a lamp at the far end of Tanner's Row when he heard footsteps behind him. Too quick for a patrol. Too light for a booted guard. He tightened his grip on the ladder's rung. A voice called softly, asking for help. It was a woman, her hood drawn low, face shadowed. She said she needed to find her way to the apothecary. Her child was ill. Raoul hesitated. Guiding her meant straying from his route, and the watch disliked lamplighters wandering beyond their assigned lamps. But her voice carried a tremor that pulled at him. He walked a few paces ahead, lighting the way with his lantern. Each step took them deeper into streets that were not his to tend. The air felt heavier here, the shadows longer. And then, as he reached to light another lamp, 3 figures stepped from the darkness. They didn't speak. One reached for his satchel, the woman vanished into the night. Raoul swung his ladder in a broad arc, catching one man in the ribs, and shouted for the watch. His cry carried down the street, bouncing off shuttered walls, until the distant clatter of armed boots answered. The thieves scattered. The watch arrived moments later, lanterns high. They asked questions, made notes, and then, almost as an afterthought, reminded Raoul that he had strayed from his assigned lamps. Curfew law was strict, even for those who kept the city lit. Raoul finished his rounds in silence. By the time he returned to the lamplighter's depot, the city was asleep. The lamps glowed faintly in their neat rows, marking the edges of streets like constellations on the ground. It was the curfew bell that emptied the streets, but it was the lamplighters who kept them from disappearing into total darkness. In the daylight rush, people hurried to beat the bell. In the night's hush, the lamplighters worked alone, their small flames holding the city together. Some believed the bell and the lamps were in quiet partnership. One imposed the rule, the other softened it. And yet, both depended on the same fixed rhythm of the day, a rhythm that made medieval life move in one unyielding loop from sunrise to bell, from bell to sunrise. In the distance, Raoul could still hear the faint hum of the river, the only constant sound that ignored the curfew. Tomorrow night, the bell would toll again, the streets would clear, and the lamps would glow one by one, as they always had. The curfew didn't stop the city, it shaped it. And the lamplighters, with their quiet, repetitive work, were part of the machinery that kept the shape intact. It was not the clatter of wheels or the murmur of the marketplace that marked the forbidden hours, it was the sound of water, low, slow, and whispering beneath the sleeping city. The streets above lay still, shutters drawn, the last candles snuffed out by the watchman's stick. The curfew bell had long since tolled, and the great iron gates at the ends of the bridge were closed. But down by the riverbank, in the fog-wrapped shadows, there was movement. a single lantern bobbed like a small star over the water, swaying with the gentle pull of the tide. Beneath it stood a man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, hands gloved in tar-stiff leather. He was a night ferryman. One of the few who dared work in the hours when no one was meant to move, the curfew law, the same one that herded the city's workers into the streets at dawn and cleared them out before dark, had left the waterways in an odd position. The rivers were lifelines, for food, for trade, for news, yet the law saw no difference between a wagon rolling over cobbles and a boat gliding over black water. Both were movement, and movement after curfew meant suspicion, but some journeys could not wait until morning. A physician's urgent delivery. A messenger carrying sealed orders. Or the quiet transport of goods best kept from the eyes of the watch. The ferrymen knew how to make these passages, with silence. With shadows, with the deep knowledge of a river's bends and shallows. His name was Thomas Aldwych, and he had rowed these forbidden waters for almost 20 years. He knew which stones along the embankment were loose enough to hide coins, which reeds concealed the path to an unmarked landing. He could read the water by sound alone. The dull slap against the hull meant shallow mudflats, the sharp hiss of rushing meant the current was turning under the bridge. Tonight, the air was heavy with the smell of wet rope and the faint sweetness of burning pitch from a distant torch. Tomas's oars dipped in perfect rhythm, barely breaking the surface. He rowed not in the middle of the river, where a stray lantern might catch his face, but along the edges, where shadows pooled like ink. Above, the city slept. Or so it seemed. In truth, the curfew was a lid over a simmering pot. Those who obeyed stayed indoors, but those who defied it, bakers, lamplighters, smugglers, had their own small networks of signals and safe paths. The ferrymen were a part of this unseen map. Thomas passed the dark mass of the bridge, its stone arches looming overhead. Somewhere on it, a watchman paced, his steps echoing faintly against the masonry. The lantern on Tomas's prow was hooded, casting just enough light to keep him from scraping against the pier. He thought of the rush-hour crowds at dawn, the crush of carts, the jostling elbows, the curses thrown when someone blocked the way. All of it was the doing of the same law that made this night river so empty. The city's leaders had decided long ago, keep the working poor penned in at night, and the streets would be safer. But safety, Thomas knew, was just another word for control. His first passenger tonight was waiting in a shadowed alcove, a woman with a basket covered in cloth. She did not speak as she stepped into the boat. But the faint clink beneath the cloth told him the basket held bottles. The kind of bottles taverns served without paying the tax. They glided over the water, the only sound the soft creak of the oarlocks. At one point, Thomas paused, listening. A faint splash upstream, another boat. He angled toward the reeds, letting the shadow swallow them until the sound faded. By the time he dropped her off at the far bank, the fog had thickened into a curtain. He liked it that way. The watch disliked damp nights. Their rounds grew shorter, their pace slower. His second fare was less discreet, 2 apprentices, their tunics still smelling of hot pitch from the dockyards. They were late returning from work and had missed the last lawful crossing. Their master would thrash them if they didn't appear by first bell. Thomas ferried them across without a word, though he noted one boy's shivering wasn't from cold. Fear traveled faster than the tide. Hour after hour, he moved through the forbidden city, not on streets, but in the veins of water beneath them. Some nights he carried only whispers, other nights secrets heavy enough to sink the boat, but always, the law hung over him. One misjudged lantern, one patrol curious enough to look down from the bridge. And he could lose his license, his boat, or worse. Yet the river called to him in a way the daylight rush never could. The dawn streets might belong to the law, but the night river belonged to those who knew its silence, and so, as the first pale thread of morning light touched the water, Tomas rowed one last time toward the bank. The city above was beginning to stir. The curfew would soon be lifted, and the rush-hour chaos would pour into the streets once more, the law's order restored, until night fell again. When the curfew bell rang, the city changed its skin. By day, the streets were arteries of noise, merchants calling out, apprentices hurrying with baskets, carts rattling over cobblestones. But at the stroke of the 9th bell, all that was stripped away. Doors shut. Windows latched. The only sounds left were the wind and the boots of the watchmen, and yet there were still messages that could not wait for dawn. They called them the night messengers, a small, tightly bound guild of trusted runners whose speed and silence were bought by kings, lords, guild masters, and sometimes those who did not wish their errands to be spoken of in daylight. Their job was perilous. Not because the streets were dangerous in the way of muggers and thieves, though those certainly roamed, but because the law itself was a predator in the dark. The curfew made being out after hours a punishable act. Each night messenger carried a brass token, stamped with the seal of the city bailiff, that allowed them to pass without arrest. But that token was a flimsy shield. A suspicious guard could claim it was forged, or worse, simply lose it in his pocket. The guild trained their runners like soldiers. They learned every shortcut, every alley, every archway where the shadows were deepest. They could scale a wall silently, slip through gardens, and cross from one side of the city to the other without their boots touching the main road more than twice. One such runner was Marjorie Blackhand, the fastest in the guild, and the one most often trusted with the most delicate errands. Tonight, she was carrying a sealed letter bound in black wax. Its message was unknown to her, the guild's oath forbade reading it, but the urgency was clear. It had to reach the north gate before the 2nd bell after curfew. She kept her head low as she slipped past a row of shuttered bakeries. The scent of bread still clung faintly to the air, an echo of the day now gone. The watchmen were thick tonight. She could hear their halberds clicking against their armor. They walked in twos, their lanterns swinging, casting moving pools of light that made the cobblestones shine like wet teeth. Marjorie ducked into an alley just before the light could touch her boots. She had learned long ago that the city was a different beast at night. In daylight, its streets were maps. At night, they were mazes. Even for a messenger, the rules of the curfew were suffocating. The law meant fewer people could travel after dark. But for those who had permission, it created a rush of frantic motion before the bell, and an equally frantic silence after. Those last-minute errands before curfew shaped how the city breathed. Tonight, the north wind was bitter, stinging her eyes. A cat yowled from a rooftop. Somewhere, a door creaked open and then shut quickly, as if afraid of being seen. She reached the fish market bridge and froze. 2 watchmen stood blocking the far end. Their lantern light bled across the wooden planks, making them impossible to cross unseen. Marjorie's mind flicked through options. She could turn back and lose time, or she could go under. Without hesitation, she slipped down the embankment. Her boots sliding in the mud, until she crouched by the waterline. The river was black, its surface trembling in the wind. She waded in, the cold biting like teeth, and kept close to the shadow of the bridge's pilings until she emerged on the other side. She could hear the watchmen laughing above her, unaware that the very message they would have confiscated had just passed beneath their feet. By the time she reached the north gate, the guard there was already yawning, leaning against the stone arch. He took the sealed letter, weighed it in his hand as if guessing its contents, then slipped it into a pouch at his belt. Marjorie turned to go, melting back into the maze of sleeping streets. The curfew still ruled the night. But for those who carried words across its silence, the city had its own heartbeat. The city had many faces after dark, ferrymen who rode against the clock, bakers who fought the cold with their ovens, lamplighters who claimed the night's first breath. But there was another presence, quieter, quicker, and almost invisible. If the ferrymen were the veins of the curfew hours, these were its nerves. They did not move goods, nor food, nor passengers. They carried only words. The curfew law, born to control the city's flow of bodies, had a peculiar side effect. It gave extraordinary value to anyone who could move after the bells. By day, a note might pass through 6 different hands and reach its destination by dusk. By night, a single trusted messenger could cross the city in half the time, if they had the courage to do it. The problem was, the law did not make exceptions for errands, business, or love letters. To deliver something during curfew meant to risk arrest, beating, or disappearance. Messengers dressed for blending in, not for comfort. Wool cloaks in dull browns, shoes softened by years of use so they made no sound, and belts with hidden pockets for folding parchment small enough to hide under a fingernail. Some carried hollowed walking sticks, where sealed letters could slide inside a false compartment. Others tucked messages beneath hat brims, stitched into linings, or even memorized entire documents to speak aloud at their destination. To move through a city under curfew was like threading a maze that changed shape with every patrol. Some streets were death traps, too narrow to vanish into a doorway, too straight to avoid a lantern's reach. Messengers learned the living map of shadows, which rooftops connected across alleys, which drains opened into basements, which back doors were left unlatched for friends. Every night, the city rewrote itself in their minds. They were rarely paid in coins alone. Some earned a loaf of bread left on a windowsill, a set of dry boots when the rain became too much, or a secret that could one day save them. The most dangerous jobs paid best, carrying a message for a guild master plotting against another, or for a merchant whose ship had docked early and needed to unload before sunrise. For a messenger, the most feared sound was not the guard's shout. It was the sudden stillness that came before it, when the faint hum of night insects stopped, when footsteps faded to nothing. The silence itself became a warning. It meant someone had noticed. It was strange, these silent couriers, sworn to secrecy and speed, became part of the very problem curfew tried to solve. The more the law restricted movement, the more valuable night messengers became. People began to delay important communications until after the bells, knowing that at night, a message could cut across the city like lightning, and so the streets before curfew became clogged with those hoping to reach their contact before the messenger did, the rush hour swelling even more each year. Some messengers became legends, like Willen III. Toes, who once carried a note from the fish market to the castle without touching the ground, running across cart tops, washing lines, and fences, or Marga the Silent, who passed through 3 guard checkpoints by pretending to be a washerwoman carrying damp linens. They were not knights, yet they lived by codes sharper than steel. If caught, a messenger faced more than a fine. Some were made examples of, lashed at the market square, their faces posted on notice boards as enemies of order. Others simply vanished, their routes inherited by another who never spoke their name aloud. Ironically, many messengers began their work not after curfew, but before it, darting through the streets in the final moments before the bell tolled, delivering half their route in daylight and the rest in shadow. It was a game of timing, of feeling the air in the city and knowing exactly when to vanish. Messengers knew each other by sight, but never by name. A raised eyebrow in a tavern might be a sign that someone needed a runner. A pair of boots drying in the window might mean do not approach tonight. This unspoken language allowed them to survive longer than the law intended. There are stories still told of the courier who carried a sealed letter for 2 weeks without knowing the sender or the receiver. When the package was finally handed off, the messenger found themselves paid with enough coin to live a year in comfort, and a note that simply read, "You were never here." The city fathers never admitted it, but without messengers, much of the commerce that fed the city's wealth would have slowed to a crawl, so the law was enforced fiercely enough to scare the common folk, but never so tightly as to snuff out the silent network entirely. It was an invisible compromise: keep the streets empty for safety, but never so empty that information stopped flowing, and so, each night, the city's heartbeat continued, not in the clamor of wagons or the shouts of market sellers, but in the near-silent steps of those who walked where they were forbidden. Their routes wove under the curfew's skin, keeping the city alive even as it slept, but there was one part of the city where no messenger dared tread, a district where the law was enforced by more than guards. That is where our story will take us next. The rush hour, born of law, grew because of those who could break it, and in their footsteps lay the map of a city that was never truly still. The night had its own heartbeat, but dawn. Dawn was the city's first breath, and in the moments just after the curfew lifted, when the bells rang low and slow from the church tower, the streets filled with figures who seemed carved from the fog, the bread carriers. They were the quiet runners between the ovens and the waking world, the first legal workers of the day. For hours before, they had been ghosts in flour-stained tunics, waiting in the shadows until the law allowed them to move. The curfew was a strange thing for them. It was both prison and protection. They could not start their routes too early without risking the guards' fine or a confiscated cart. Yet if they started too late, the city's rush hour, that sudden avalanche of humanity unleashed by the lifting of the curfew, would devour their paths. In the black kitchens of the bakehouses, where stone ovens roared and the air shimmered with heat, the bread had been baking since the middle of the night. The bakers, pale with exhaustion, their aprons dusted like frost, would glance to the small slit of a window, gauging the faintest silver light. And then, like a signal, one would nod. The carriers would step forward, shouldering baskets, yokes, and covered trays. The first bell would toll, slow, sonorous, and the gates of the bakery yard would swing open. The streets in those first legal minutes of movement were unlike any other time of day. The night watch was fading into the barracks, lanterns dim in their hands. The lamplighters, still half in shadow, were making their final rounds to extinguish what the morning sun would soon overpower. And into this soft collision between night and day came the bread carriers, their pace brisk, their loads precious. They moved with almost military precision. Many were young boys or women strong from years of balancing baskets. They wove through narrow alleys where the cobblestones still glistened with last night's rain. The air smelled of yeast and ash, and the only sound was the muffled slap of their shoes and the occasional knock at a door. Bread was more than food, it was survival. For the poorest quarters, the carriers brought black rye loaves, dense and sour, wrapped in cloth to keep the warmth in. For the richer lanes, their baskets held pale wheat bread, golden-crusted and aromatic, each loaf a small luxury. And for the abbeys and noble households, there were fine rolls glazed to a shine. Meant for feasts and morning tables dressed with silver, the law's strange rhythm made them part of the city's daily theater. Just as the streets began to choke with carts, merchants, and apprentices streaming to their workshops, the carriers would vanish. Their work was over by the first full hour after dawn. To linger meant to be caught in the surge, the real rush hour. The medieval law that locked the city down at night also compressed the day's opening into a narrow window. And in that window, the bread carriers were kings and queens of the road, but their routes were not without danger. Even in that lawful hour, there were hands eager to snatch a loaf, street urchins quick as cats who could slip a roll from a basket in a blink. The carriers knew every back lane, every shortcut, every doorway where they could step aside to let the rush pass. And sometimes, they knew the guards well enough to exchange a loaf for a blind eye when starting a few minutes early. The rush hour world that the curfew created was an odd paradox. It made the streets safer at night, yet more chaotic in the morning. The bread carriers learned to live between those extremes. They were not part of the frantic noise of traders shouting prices, nor the steady grind of carts on stone. Their time was fleeting, almost invisible. By mid-morning, they were gone, returning to the bakehouses to scrub trays, stoke fires, and begin again. There was a strange dignity to it. Many of them came from families who had carried bread for generations. Fathers passed routes to sons, mothers taught daughters the art of balancing 20 loaves on a single padded board atop the head. Some routes had stories: the alley where an ancestor once hid from the watch, the courtyard where a nobleman paid double for bread during a siege, the bridge where a winter frost once froze every loaf solid before it could be sold, and so the bread carriers lived within the pulse of the city's law. They worked at the seam between night and day, between silence and the roar of the morning crowd. The curfew was their invisible clock, its lifting their starting gun. And though they vanished quickly, their scent lingered, warm, yeasty, comforting, long after they were gone. By the time the market squares were in full cry, and the smiths' hammers rang in chorus with the cries of fishmongers, the bread carriers had slipped back into the unseen layers of the city. But their work had already shaped the day. The loaves they left behind fed the workers who built the walls, the scribes who inked the laws, the guards who patrolled the streets they once dashed through. In this way, the medieval law that forced the city into stillness at night had, unknowingly, given the bread carriers their stage. For one brief hour each morning, they ruled the streets, not with noise, but with quiet efficiency, with baskets that smelled of dawn itself. The air was thick with damp earth and the faint tang of iron from the riverbanks. It was a night like countless others, yet the streets were alive with an energy that didn't belong to the day. Under the moon's dim silver, merchants, craftsmen, and late-returning travelers pushed forward along the narrow lanes, driven by the invisible clock that had ruled their lives for generations. The curfew bell, the toll-keepers waited for them. These were not the toll houses of daylight, with their neat ledgers and bustling queues of wagons. No, the toll-keepers of the midnight roads were creatures of shadow, half watchmen, half taxmen, stationed at choke points where the city's arteries narrowed to a trickle, the bridges. The gates, the narrow wooden planks across stagnant moats, they were part of the machinery that the medieval law that created rush hour had set into motion. That same curfew that pushed thousands to hurry home before the night watch closed the gates had also birthed a quiet economy in the margins. If you wanted to cross after the bell, you could, for a price. By law, the toll-keepers had no authority to lift the curfew, only to allow passage for urgent matters of king and country. But urgency was a slippery word, and the clink of coin had a way of bending its definition. What began as an emergency service, letting doctors through in plague time, or messengers during siege, became an unofficial marketplace of movement. Some paid to fetch a surgeon for a relative's failing breath, others slipped silver into calloused palms simply because they had lingered too long at a tavern. The toll-keepers' stations were small wooden huts, their roofs thatched and blackened with smoke from the lanterns that burned all night. Each kept a brazier for warmth, a bench for records, and a chest with 3 locks, one key for the toll-keeper, one for the sheriff, and one for the city clerk. The theory was that no one could pilfer without the others. In practice, those chests often jingled with coins that never saw a ledger. It was not just humans they counted, the toll law extended to carts, animals, and goods. A merchant bringing in barrels of ale after hours paid twice, once for himself, and once for each cask, calculated at a fraction of the day rate. A farmer leading 2 oxen under the moonlight might pay the toll in copper or in kind. Leaving behind a sack of onions or a slab of salted pork, the stories around these toll-keepers were as thick as the fog that clung to the gates. One night, it was said, a toll-keeper refused a group of musicians, declaring their fiddles and lutes unnecessary for urgent travel. They returned hours later, playing a mournful tune that drifted through the city until even the watchmen leaned on their halberds to listen. The toll-keeper let them through for free, and for months after, demanded music as payment from passing minstrels. Another tale told of a toll-keeper who could judge a man's honesty by the way he approached the gate. If the lantern light caught hesitation in his step, the toll was doubled. If the traveler met his gaze directly, the toll was halved, sometimes waived entirely. But toll-keeping was not without danger. Bandits, knowing the value of coins kept in those three-locked chests, often lurked on the roads leading to the stations. The most daring thieves posed as toll-keepers themselves, setting up false gates in the mist, collecting their fees before vanishing into the dark. By the time the real toll-keeper arrived, the travelers were already gone, and the city coffers none the richer. For the honest toll-keepers, there was a code, unwritten, yet fiercely upheld. You never charged a mother with a sick child in her arms. You never took coin from a messenger bearing a seal of royal wax. And you always kept the brazier lit, so that no traveler mistook the post for abandoned safety and was caught unprepared by the night watch. Some broke the code, of course. Some grew rich by overcharging, or by striking deals with certain traders to let them pass untaxed in exchange for a share of profits. Yet even in corruption, the toll-keepers were bound to the rush-hour world. They were its gate valves, deciding who flowed freely and who stalled. When the curfew bell sounded each night, it was like the winding of a spring. The city tensed, people hurried, animals bellowed in the streets. And then, in the small hours, the toll-keepers sat in their huts, the rush behind them, collecting the stragglers like fishermen hauling in the last of the catch. They were not loved, but they were remembered. Their names rarely made the records, just the marks in the ledgers. The tolls collected, the rare exemptions granted. Yet they were part of the invisible architecture of medieval life, shaping the way people moved, when they hurried, and how far they could go after dark. The curfew may have been the law that created rush hour, but the toll-keepers ensured it never truly ended. The bell rang twice, its deep tone rolled over the rooftops like a slow wave of iron, fading into the mist that clung to the riverbanks. The streets, once scattered with late returners and cautious shopkeepers, now began their quiet transformation. This was the watchman's hour, the time when the curfew was not merely a rule but a living presence, carried in the footsteps of those who enforced it. You could tell the watchmen by their lanterns, each one swinging with a rhythm as steady as their breath. The glow was not warm and golden like a hearth, but sharp, focused, light meant to find you. The medieval curfew law, first written to prevent fires and riots, had by this time become a kind of nightly theater, the citizens hurrying home. The watchmen patrolling, the shutters slamming, and the echo of boots over cobblestones. In some districts, the hour after curfew was more dangerous than the daylight's busiest rush. It was not because of thieves alone, though they too took their chances, but because the law allowed the watchman a wide authority. Anyone found wandering could be questioned, fined, or taken in for the night. This power was not always abused, but its presence made every step in the wrong place after the bell a calculated risk. In the tanner's quarter, you could still smell the heavy scent of curing hides even after the work had stopped. The air was damp, the alleyways narrow, and the watchman's light revealed the wet glisten of the stones. A boy with a basket of leftover bread hurried along, keeping to the shadows, but the watchman's lantern caught him. A brief exchange, the boy showing a token from the baker's guild, and he was allowed to pass. Others were not so lucky. On the bridge, a merchant's apprentice stood arguing with a guard. His master had sent him late to deliver a pouch of coin to the far side of the city, and now he found himself caught between duty and the law. The argument was quiet, voices muffled in the fog, but the shape of it was one repeated every night in dozens of corners. The curfew created a world where time itself was the ruler, and the bell its unyielding herald. The wealthy handled it differently. Their homes had private gates, often with side doors that opened into guarded courtyards. Servants returning late would sometimes slip inside unseen, bypassing the patrols entirely. For the poor, there were no such shortcuts. The curfew line was drawn across their doorsteps, and the choice was simple: obey, or be noticed, yet the law had its ironies. In the very act of making the city quiet, it made certain sounds far louder. The creak of a cartwheel on a distant lane. The faint splash of an oar in the river. The cough of a man leaning against a wall in the cold. Each one seemed to carry farther, as if the night itself was listening, and somewhere above it all, in the high chamber of the belfry, the bellman rested his hands on the great rope, waiting for the signal that the watch had completed its first circuit. Below him, the city lay still, but not empty. Never empty. The medieval law that created rush hour in the day also gave birth to this other rush, the last. Urgent footsteps before the watchman's hour began. If the daytime rush was a stampede of necessity, the nighttime one was a dance with the edge of the law. The city was different at night, it always had been. From the high clock tower, a single bell tolled in the distance, not hurried, not panicked, but deliberate, each ring spilling into the streets like warm candle wax. In the medieval world, that sound meant one thing: the day had ended, and the law had spoken. Shops would close not when they pleased, but when the curfew bell commanded it. The hour was not a suggestion, it was a boundary. Once crossed, the world shifted. The market stalls that only an hour earlier had shouted with the barter of apples, smoked eels, and bright dyed cloth were now half shrouded in tarps. Merchants bound up their goods in waxed canvas, wooden shutters thudded closed. And the sound of commerce dissolved into the gentle rhythm of feet hurrying home. The rush was not a modern invention, in truth, it was born here, in the dim torchlight centuries ago. Cobbled lanes glistening after a light rain, the air heavy with the smell of damp stone and smoke from hundreds of hearths being stoked for the evening meal. The shop signs, painted with pictures for the illiterate, creaked on iron hooks as the last of the day's trade was done. A baker's boy darted through the crowd, carrying a basket of still warm loaves for a wealthy patron. A tanner's apprentice locked up with hands still raw from lime water. And through it all, the city watch moved like quiet shadows, reminding anyone lingering too long that the law was not to be ignored. The bell was the city's heart, and its heartbeat was regular: day, work, trade, then curfew. Break it, and you risked more than a fine. Some towns imposed public shaming, standing in the stocks for an hour, a torch burning beside you so all could see your face. The law was both the shepherd and the fence. Today, we think of rush hour as a byproduct of cars and office schedules. But in the medieval world, it was written in sound: the echo of the curfew bell over rooftops, the crackle of torches being lit, the thud of gates being drawn shut. Why? Because the city was not safe after dark. The curfew was not simply a matter of order, it was survival. In the deep hours, streets were unlit save for the occasional oil lamp. Thieves prowled, fires spread unseen until too late, and any honest citizen was expected to be indoors. If you listened carefully on such nights, you could hear the city breathe, an exhale as doors closed, then a long, steady quiet, in the countryside beyond. Villages followed the same rhythm. The sound was different, perhaps a smaller bell, or even the ringing of an iron triangle, but the meaning was the same: go home, bar your door, stay in the safety of the hearth. In our modern world, we carry clocks on our wrists, in our pockets, on glowing screens. In theirs, the city itself was the clock, the marketplace was the minute hand, its pace quickening as the final bell approached. The watchmen were the hour hand, moving slow but steady. The sky was the clock face, light to dark, season to season. The medieval law that created rush hour was not an inconvenience, it was the architecture of their day. Remove it, and the rhythm would collapse into chaos. And so, for centuries, the bell tolled and the people moved. They did not argue with the hour, they obeyed it. When the last cart rumbled through the main gate, the portcullis would lower with the grinding groan of iron on wood. It was not a gentle sound, it was a statement: the city was sealed. No one entered, no one left. The outer roads fell silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the faint splash of water in a ditch. Inside, the streets became narrower not because the stones had changed, but because the darkness pressed in. Torches hissed when touched by light rain, smoke trailing upward like ghostly fingers, and here, in this dimmed world, you could feel the heartbeat slow. It was not fear, exactly, it was a surrender to the inevitable. If you've ever stood on a subway platform at 5:30 p.m. watching hundreds pour through turnstiles in a single direction, you have felt the ghost of this law. If you've raced to make the last train, or hurried to beat the supermarket's closing shutters, you've walked in step with medieval merchants. We believe our rush hour is born of modern busyness, but really, we inherited it. It came with the bell. Today, we can buy milk at midnight, call a taxi at 3 a.m., or scroll through glowing screens until dawn. The law no longer tells us to stop, we tell ourselves, and often, we fail, but in losing the curfew, we lost something else: the collective pause. That moment when the entire community moved together, shut their doors together, and exhaled into quiet together. The medieval city's stillness after curfew was not just about safety, it was about unity. Everyone lived by the same clock. The blacksmith, the baker, the lord, the pauper, all obeyed the same hour. Now, our clocks are private things. Our schedules run in parallel, rarely touching. The shared rhythm is gone. To live by the curfew was to understand limits, and to rest because the day allowed it. There was a peace in knowing that nothing more could be done until the bell rang again in the morning. Perhaps there is a lesson in that, even for us. Not that we return to laws that dictate our movements, but that we remember the value of shared endings. That we make, in our own way, a bell to close our day, because the truth is, rush hour never disappeared. It simply changed shape. It still pushes us homeward, still reminds us that the day has edges, even if the night is full of light. The bell tolls no more in the marketplace. The gates remain open, and the roads stretch endlessly into the lit horizon. But if you listen, sometimes, in the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt or the hurried steps on a late train platform, you can still hear it. It is the last breath of a day, carried across centuries. Reminder that even in our restless world, there was once a time when we all stopped together. And maybe, if we're quiet enough, we still can. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,